So while we're getting started, I'll introduce myself. I am Ocean Watcher of the House of Chimera system. My two stereotypes are a frilled shark and blue glossless. It's a sea slug. It's a sea slug. So today we're going to be talking about. We're specifically going to be talking about media as it comes to when non-kin have talked about otherkin, or when, in a few cases that we're going to be talking about, are when kin have talked about being kin that has reached a really wide non-kin audience. So we're not going to be talking a lot about media that otherkin have made for otherkin that have kind of stayed within our bubble. We're also not going to be talking about troll stuff outside of one book, because it's actually a book that someone actually managed to write. So to start off, the earliest stuff that we have in writing that still exists is the letters that were written for Green Egg, which were written by the Elf Queen's daughters. We actually have a few of the copies. We're so lucky to have a few scans of those. In a lot of them, the Elf Queen's daughters didn't mention a lot about their identity. They called themselves elves, and they referenced their elven sisters, etc. And these pages were mostly like one-page little letters, and they really didn't have a whole lot of. They more about spirituality than what we would now call otherkinity, but they're still a very important piece of media, and because they were actually written as part of a pagan newsletter that was actually printed out and distributed, it's very interesting. What you got? Oh, I didn't know that they were in a compilation. Thank you for that link. I will be looking at that later. So besides, after those letters were printed, and Drawing Down the Moon by Margaret Alder, which the revised and expanded edition came out in 1986, they actually, the author actually referenced the Elf Queen's daughters. To quote on page 319, they were described as a network of elves located mostly in the far west. And also in the appendix, the Silver Elves were referenced on page 222, as they were described as a small group that sends out elvish letters from time to time and spreads magic about the world, finding elves and fae folk here and there. And it goes on from there. So Drawing Down the Moon was the first time, as far back as I can see, that someone referenced a group of otherkin talking about them. I think there's someone in the chat that knows far more about this early part of history than I do. That's really nice, because unfortunately we really don't know a whole lot about that early part of the community when it comes to the elven kind. We're currently trying to better our information, but really we tend to focus so much on the therianthropy that sometimes it hinders our own interests. So to move forward, the next time that people that identify as non-human were mentioned is a book called Werewolves by Daniel Cullen, which came out in 1996, and it actually had a whole chapter called, quote, Werewolves on the Internet, and it was about Altor werewolves. Even though Altor werewolves had only existed 3 years prior, they already had someone writing about them, and the chapter goes on to the author talking about meeting real-life werewolves, and talking about a few of the people on there said that they claimed to be able to shapeshift, and a few people just simply claiming that they dreamed of being werewolves. And the book itself is actually written for young adults, which is kind of amusing based on the fact that Altor werewolves at the time was mostly people that were in college, so an interesting split of the audience of the book versus the community that existed at the time. After that, the oldest piece of media that we have found is from 1997, when on Coast to Coast AM, a wearer by the name of Lance called in to a broadcast that was going on between a Father Martin and Art Bell, who's the host of Coast to Coast AM, and he asked the father what he thought of people that were lycanthropes, and they actually had a 4-minute conversation about people that actually are werewolves and have dreams of being a werewolf and helping people, was what Lance mentioned. And there was actually this really positive conversation with the father mentioning that he actually had heard of other people that were werewolves and thought it could be a positive thing, was actually some of the wording that was used. After that, there was a independent book published called Are You a Unicorn? Mission and Meaning of Unicorns, that was published in 1997. Oh, those are even better scans than I have. I am stealing those. Thank you very much. Yeah, our scans are absolutely horrible to read and get any. Every time we look at the scans, we have to kind of squint and try to see, okay, what letter is that? So thank you so much for posting those. The Are You a Unicorn was written by the same person that created the Unicorns United website, which was a person that identified as with unicorns, but didn't know about the Otherkin community. So the book itself it doesn't go too deep into identifying as a unicorn, and more went into Christianity symbolism of a unicorn pretty quickly, but it's still an interesting book. After that, in 1999, there was the Werewolf book, the Encyclopedia of Shape-Shifting Beings, which actually was one of the first things that we found when we were 13 and looking for information on, I identify as an animal, what is this thing? And we found this book. And it actually has an entry defining Howl's quote, and it actually quoted Altor Werewolf, the FAQ of Altor Werewolves, and even mentions the 1994 Harvest Howl, which was one of the earliest howl that took place on Altor Werewolves. There was also an entry called theriomorph, which theriomorph was a term that never took off in the therian community. It was basically an early predecessor. It was bouncing around the same time that people were picking up the therianthrope term, but they ended up picking therianthrope instead of theriomorph, but somehow it ended up in this encyclopedia, and the entry references modern spiritual therianthropes who it is quoted, their quote, in inner identification as a particular animal. So there's that. It's a 1999, kind of going on from there. 2000, the book The Magic of Shapeshifting came out, and this was by a person called Rosalind Green. There's some debate on if that was even the person's name. This book had a lot of controversy when it came out, and there are still some werewolves that came out in the time that are still kind of irritated at its existence. Its biggest problem is the author claimed that physical shifting was a thing, along with other kinds of physical proof issues. The author also claimed that the werewolves, that people that were put on trial for werewolves during the Inquisition were actually Therians, full stop. And that fact is very debatable. The other thing that was very criticized about the book is, at the time, the author heavily copy and pasted from existing websites at the time. Or if that isn't the case, we haven't found exact proof that it exists, that happened, but we have heard so many wearers at the time say that happened, and it just reading the text and then reading articles, archives of websites at the time, that we would not be surprised if that exists. But we have heard several wearers at the time who were around at the time say that the book heavily plagiarized actual were sites in various places. So there's a lot of issues with that book, and it's still in print last time we checked, so it's still out there, unfortunately. The next really interesting thing that happened was for a news radio out of Utah, where a were by the name of Wolf Mage, who we think is still around in the were community in places, in October 31st, 2000, so right on Halloween, he had an interview talking about being a were in the were community. During the interview, Mage defined being a were as having a very deep bond or connection with their spirit animal. Again, the were community was still kind of iffy on how to define itself, so that's not surprising. And throughout the interview, Wolf Mage actually identified as a were. The spirit of the magic of shape-shifting, it had one chapter dedicated to the idea of physical shifting, and another page dedicated to the idea of physical bilocation shift, not just bilocation shifting, not just leaving your body in kind of an astral projection, but actually physically manifesting in a non-human body. And sorry if I'm missing some questions in the chat. I'll definitely leave some space after the ending. Yes, that's exactly the recording. Thank you very much for that link. At the end, if there's anything that we miss or anything you want us to expand on, we will definitely get to those things. We're just kind of burning through to get to some of the big stuff, and then we can talk about more stuff. So beyond that. During 2001, a number of newspapers and magazines just started talking about Otherkin back to back. The Village Voice, they had an article on Otherkin called "Elven Like Me," where they mentioned several Otherkin that were quasi. Oh yeah, because it does. Yes, the Otherkin.net is mentioned in the piece. We actually, a bunch of these we just had to really quickly go through and remember what on earth was even said in them. So I'm so glad that people are linking them in the chat. Like, yes, here's links. They're amazing. Then another thing that happened was in Fate magazine, March 2001, the internet goes mythic, which thank you so much for having a copy of this saved on the internet, because even despite having interlibrary loan abilities, we could not find a physical copy of that article, so thank you so much for having a digital copy of it somewhere on the internet. But yeah, on that, people that identify as Otherkin were mentioned, specifically heavily talking about people that identify as Elven and Fae. That's one interesting thing about this time frame, is they really all Otherkin were mentioned, including people that identify as werewolves, etc., but they really focused on people that identified as Elf and Fae, and that seems like a reflection of the Otherkin community at the time, perhaps, of people who, the population of people with different kin types. It's really interesting. Another article that happened at the time was another Village Voice article called Human Behavior, and it was, this was one that we didn't get a chance to reread through, but memory is wanting to say that it was a response to it was a sent-in response to the previous Elven Like Me article. After that, among other things, was in a magazine called Take One. Otherkin were briefly mentioned. The article itself was talking about a documentary called The Fairy Faith, and Otherkin were briefly mentioned as defined as a growing group of people who believe that they are really different types of fairies and other fantastical beings. They claim that they heal faster than regular people, have wings in previous incarnations, and so on. After that, among other things, big things that came out, a documentary called Animal Imitators, which we have a special nostalgia for because that's actually how we found the Were community. Within that documentary, Stalking Cat, who we just talked about in the previous Body Mods panel, was interviewed. And while Stalking Cat, as far as we are aware, has never identified as Otherkin or Therian, his experiences definitely towed the line with him identifying as a cat and with a cat in ways that, at least for us, really piqued our interest. And then full on, another person that was interviewed for that documentary was Coyote, who was the creator of Werelist and still occasionally makes appearances within the Were community today. So that's how we discovered the Were, because he actually used the term Were in the documentary and full on talked about identifying as a Were Coyote. So, and that was the first time that in a documentary, that the earliest documentary we have heard of that mentions Otherkin, Therians, etc. Yes, the Veil's Edge. We're gonna get to that in a second. The Veil's Edge was it is a neo-pagan occult book. Kind of talked a little bit about everything in there, and it had a chapter 5, called Fey Blood and Play Magic, where they talked about Otherkin were talked about, the earlier Fate article is mentioned, etc. Sorry, I need to take a drink. Other non-academic books at this time that mentioned Otherkin include The Grimoire of the Apprentice Wizard by, I'm always butchering his name, Oberon Zell Ravenheart, which is the book always felt like it was carrying on the coattails of the Harry Potter mystique that was going on. It was a book about witchcraft, pagan philosophy, and mythology that was geared towards the young adults. But it happened to, in a section talking about werewolves, happened to mention actual Therians and Otherkin. They're introduced as a group of real-life people that identify as such. So that in and of itself is kind of a recurring theme where people will be talking about mythical creatures or werewolves, and suddenly, they'll actually mention real-life people who are Therians, Otherkin, etc. And that happens a lot in a majority of the stuff that we find. It's not, they're not talking about Otherkin themselves, they're talking about other topics, and then suddenly, but there's also these people. Not in Kansas Anymore is another book that is about magic, and it happens to mention they mention the Silver Elves, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I'm looking at my notes, they even interviewed the Silver Elves a little in that book. If it's not in Kansas Anymore, it's another book that came out around this time. And I'm so going to be rereading through this chat because there's so many stuff that we're missing that, that sounds interesting. Ooh, that sounds interesting. Another thing that happened in 2006, the Therian Bible was published. And we don't know if anyone in the chat remembers that fiasco, but it was a fiasco. The Therian Bible, to backtrack, the Therian Bible was published by a group called the Therian Temple. And the Therian Temple were a group of people that wanted to create a kind of pseudo-religious practice around therianthropy. This was very controversial, and they were very quickly banned from most forums, as far as we remember. They had very strict ideas on what was proper etiquette for a therin, and members were required to take an oath called the Oath of Theron, which states that a person was a true therin, and they had to follow the Therian code for the rest of their life. The Therian code also included things such as, if you were to take this code, you were not allowed to eat meat for the rest of your life because they considered it cannibalism, due to Therins being part animal and part human. That's one of the easy pot shots that people took at why they didn't like this book and why they didn't like the Therian Temple as a general whole. But the book itself, it's very... If you know anything about ceremonial magic, it reads as a very... Someone took ceremonial magic and kind of thinly veiled shifting over it. Majority of the book is just filled with very ritualistic ways of trying to induce a shift, mental shift, etc. And the final chapter of the book is about is about what they call a physical shift, but when they use the term physical shift, they're actually referring to a mental / sensory based shift and not a physical transformation at all. But the fact that they use physical shift just did not help them, and they weren't widely received, and they kind of, after the book was published, they kind of fell out into obscurity, and they just kind of stayed in controversial... People talked about them, and people knew about them, but they were never actually a big thing that happened in the community. They never had a lot of stuff going on besides making a bit of drama. After that, Linda Godfrey published several books around this time, talking roughly within these few years, published several books about the Beast of Bray Road and various sightings of werewolf-like cryptids. And in all three of her books, she actually ends up mentioning people that self-identify as... People are so quick at pulling in links of what I'm talking about. This is so awesome. All three of her books, Beast of Bray Road, Hunting the American Werewolf, and Werewolves, I'm blanking on the list, but it's in the list, ended up mentioning people that self-identify as werewolves, in a few cases talking about people that claim to physical shift, and on a few other cases talking about people that are spiritual therianthropes, as she quotes it. In fact, one of her books, I'm forgetting which one, where's my links, I don't want to scroll too far, but actually there's a mini interview with someone that identifies as a werecat. And it's a very little interesting tidbit, though that person more defines their identity as more something that they chose, so using our current terminology, he would be more of a I'm blanking on the word. Yes, otherlinker. Thank you so much. But either way, his experiences are very interesting, to say the least. After that, the next big thing that really happened was the Otherkin calls and more that happened on Coast to Coast AM, and this is something that is more personally interesting to us because of its fallout over time within people that watch Coast to Coast AM. On this date, January 27. The host, who was Ian Punnett, someone had linked to him a movie called The Transfiguration of Harold Maines, which was a indie movie that came out around this time, of someone that really identified as a horse and thought he had a horse soul. And the movie is about him disappearing, and right after he disappears, a horse appears, and his family are convinced the horse is Harold. And Ian was fascinated by this movie that was sent to him, and along with it, the person that had sent to him identified as a horse in human form. And so this sparked him to have this show where a live feed, people were given a special line who identified as Otherkin to call in and talk about being Otherkin. And a number of people called in, some identifying as Otherkin, some not. A few people, one person that called in identified as a furry. But the radio record itself is very interesting, and you can find it. You have to search on archive.org if people are having trouble finding it. I can give a link, but you can find it for free online through archive.org by searching Coast to Coast AM and then searching through the years, and they're all in there. We actually had copies of them prior, but then we found the archive and realized they had far better copies than we did. So, yes, it's the Transfiguration of Harold Maines, and it's no longer available, but we have a copy. Yeah, Maines is in not Maine as in hair, but yeah, with an I. But definitely the creator was definitely going for a bit of a pun. And Ian actually interviewed the creator, director, writer, and asked him if he knew about Otherkin. And he said he actually hadn't beforehand, but very quickly after the movie was made and published, he started having people because this was in 2007, people were emailing him, sending him letters talking about how much they related to this movie. So Otherkin calls and more happened, and at the very end of the call, someone called, who later became known as Jason the Horse, called in, who was a person who had actually given Ian the name of the movie, and they ended up having such an interesting conversation that even though the radio cast was about to end, Ian promised to get in contact with Jason again so that they could talk more. And that happened 2 weeks later on Coast to Coast Live. Ian specifically had Jason the Horse on for a guest show where it was just him and Ian talking about Jason's experiences. People would call in, ask Jason questions, and he would answer. Unlike the Coast to Coast AM episodes, which I'm going to be talking about, checking my time. Unlike the Coast to Coast AMs, where you can easily find them on archive, or they are archived on Coast to Coast AM's actual website, and then you can also find them on archive.org. The Coast to Coast Live apparently is not recorded, but we have a copy of that recording anyway. Because we are obsessed with stuff, and if someone says it exists, we're going to hunt it down. So, and that the entire call was just them talking to each other, and occasionally getting guest calls come in. And yes, that is the Coast to Coast Live. But if you want a free copy, you look on archive.org. I'm going to try to pick up a little so we have time if anyone has questions, because I want to get to people's questions if they have any. So that happened, and then the big thing came out. 2007, A Field Guide to Otherkin. Field Guide to Otherkin was published by Lupa. The book is a compilation of what she did was the year prior on LiveJournal. She put out a large survey that people were free to respond to. And the book itself is heavily based around these responses that she got. The book is heavily quoted is heavily quoted from these various answers that she got from these responders. And if someone really wants a direct note, I can check in the book that I actually have all of my physical books sitting beside me, along with all the books that are on my computer sitting open on a file. But almost 200 or 300 people responded to this book, and it shows in the amount of quotes that happen in this book. And even though some of the other aspects of the book have definitely not fared as well over time, especially she heavily uses references to mythology, which aren't as big of a deal in the Otherkin community as today, but the quotes hold up so wonderfully. The book talks about therians, vampires, because still at this time the vampire community was are they or are not Otherkin, but now we definitely consider them their own community. They're alter-human, but they're not Otherkin. Whereas back then it was still kind of meh. Or at least in the Otherkin community they were still not convinced, that they were still debating on if they were or they were not. Also has a chapter on elves and fae, dragons and other mythical beasts, and it even has a subset talking about otaku-kin, which we now use today as fiction-kin, but back then the term otaku-kin was still sometimes passed around. So it's a very wonderful book, and for people that are wondering why is the book no longer in print, in 2013, in April, Lupa stepped away from identifying as a therianthrope. For many years prior, at least, I believe she came into the community in 2001. She decided that she no longer identified as a wolf to the extent that therian meant. And because the book was so popular, people were always asking for her to have interviews, and because she no longer thought the book, she no longer felt that the book meant as, she no longer related to the community that the book was about anymore, so she ended up letting the book fall out of print. And that's why finding copies of it are incredibly difficult. And the book, I don't believe the book was ever had a PDF file of it, how you can easily buy most books for Kindle, etc. I don't think the book had a digital copy. But we have a digital copy because we were so obsessed with not losing our physical copy, we scanned our whole darn book to make sure that if something physically happened to our house and our whole house burned down, our copy of Field Guide to Otherkin was not destroyed with it. Because we're a tiny bit obsessed with our collection of stuff. Yes, Blupa is still publishing, and she's still doing other things, but she no longer does anything related to Otherkin, therianthropy, etc. After this time, Linda Godfrey did another book, Werewolves, Mysteries, Legends, and the Unexplained Phenomenon. She talked about therianthropy in that book, actually set for a number of pages, fairly extensively. A mini documentary that you can find on YouTube called 10 Ways Shorts Do Werewolves Exist, in which Golden Wolf, who is a furry artist or anthro artist, I forget if she identifies as a furry or not, but she's rather well known within the furry community. She, at the time, identified as aware and actually had done several annual howls called Howlapalooza. She no longer, I believe a number of years ago, around 2009, she dropped identifying as a were/therian. But that little bit of that interview is still on YouTube. Last time we saw, where, again, real life werewolves. We're gonna be hitting your next door neighbor is a dragon. This was a book that was written by a troll from Something Awful, which at the time, think 4chan. It was think of the cringe, the people that exist today that do all those cringe videos. That's what Something Awful was, just in text form. They would go into forums, screenshot people, laugh at them, which actually we have today still in cringe subreddits, etc. So it's nothing new. The book has several chapters. One chapter related to specifically for Dragonkin, and another chapter laughing at Elfkin. Plus a few other random mentions here and there of Otherkin throughout the book. It's not a good read, but it's I think it's still in print for some reason. People just keep posting stuff like, ooh, I hadn't heard of that. Ooh, I remember that. Or, ooh, that's not in our list yet. Jason the Horse came back onto Coast to Coast AM in June 2009. Again, it was Ian and Jason sat together. They had a conversation, and it was mostly just them talking with some people, calling in and asking questions kind of thing. Make sure, where am I? Okay, I haven't hit it yet. In 2009, in October 18th, 2009, Savage, who is a admin of Werelist, and another therian from Werelist, they took part in a radio cast for KAPS, which called Werewolves: The Truth from Those Who Are, and it was basically another here are the people that are the closest real life equivalent to werewolves. It used to be up online, but I think they took it down. But it's a very interesting, approximately 2-hour interview of them talking about their therianthropy. Shifting Hearts, that is a very interesting. I'm getting very close on time, so I'm going to try and get to as many of these before I hit start taking questions. It's a very interesting book of short stories, but due to it being fiction, we didn't think it would fit really well in with this list, which is already very extensive, and we're trying to get to as much as possible. A few other things that happened. Another book, Werewolves: The Occult Truth by, I'm going to butcher this name, Konstantinos. I'm sorry. Came out in 2010, and the majority of the book is talking about werewolves from an occult and pagan for an occult and pagan audience. But in chapter 11, called Astral Werewolves, there is a section section called Otherkin Therians, which talks about therianthropy to an extent. Werewolves: The Occult Truth. Yes, that's what I'm referencing right then. There have been several news articles that are not in English, and I'm not going to butcher trying to pronounce the titles. So, but they are. That's another reason why I gave everyone this file, so that they can read and try and decipher what I'm trying to say. But things were not just published in English. There are also several news articles, etc., talking about therianthropy, Otherkin, around the world. It's very, very interesting. Teenage Vampires came out by Channel 4 in 2011. We have a copy of it, and we haven't gotten around to watching it. It's one of those things where we haven't had the courage to sit down and watch it, but it has been sitting in a file on our desktop for ages. We think, if we're not mistaken, the documentary also touches on teen werewolves, but we're not positive. Oops, sorry. Let's see. A few other things that have come out over time. In 2012, Creatures of the Night, In Search of Ghosts, Vampires, Werewolves, and Demons. There is a chapter within it called Oh Grandmother, What Big Teeth You Have, which is specifically about werewolves. And within towards the end of the chapter, the author brings up the topic of Otherkin, specifically starts talking about therians. And the interesting thing is, Wolf Van Zandt, who is a longtime therian in the community, he's still occasionally found here and there, was actually met and interviewed, for this book. And the author brings up various kinds of shifting, quotes from A Field Guide to Otherkin, and talks a little about the history, or Wolf Van Zandt brings up his belief that therians are connected to the werewolves of the past, such as the Lovian werewolf, Theseus, and the Benedante. In April 2013, the documentary What I Think I'm an Animal came out, and the memes that have come out of this documentary are legendary. Yeah, all the responses, yes. A little bit of interesting thing about this documentary is, for people that don't know the history, that weren't, for months prior to this documentary even being published, the creators of this documentary kept on bugging forums. They would try to join, try to find people interested, and they kept getting banned, kicked off, denied. And the whole thing with Nia finally coming forward and deciding to be part of it was based on how much this company kept basically bothering the community, trying to find other people come on screen to talk about their identity, because the community does not have a good history with being put in front of a computer, put in front of a camera and talking about their experiences. I missed it. And where is it? There is The Real Wolfman. Sorry, I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I somehow missed it. In October 2009 on the History Channel, The Real Wolfman came out. In this long 2-hour documentary, a tiny snippet mentions therians, and in that snippet, the two hosts, quote, find a video of someone that is a therian that had recently gone through a shift, talking about shifting. And we were there on Werelist when there was like a whole party of people waiting for the documentary to premiere on History Channel, and then finally getting to that clip. And we recall so clearly watching the threads of responses of people realizing how much the producers and editors very heavily chopped up this therian's interview to fit their idea of what they wanted to portray and what they kind of the original film was of the person. They both had a sit down interview, and then they also brought the person out into the forest so where they could induce a mental shift. And what they kept in the documentary was the person coming out of a mental shift and not being able to really talk about the person was having trouble speaking, etc. And that's what they put in the documentary, and it didn't go very well. So So, What I Think I'm an Animal isn't the first time that someone heavily chopped up an interview to make and to do what they wanted with the content, the Otherkin and therians that they were interviewing. So, there's 10 minutes. I'm so sorry. There's so much other content, and I'm so excited to get to so much of it. So I'm going to start taking questions or comments. There's so many people that have posted so many good things in the chat. I will be definitely going through and reading so much of, reading through the links and everything. So, what do people want to talk about? Chat, comment, chat, questions, etc. What would you recommend people not do when making media about Otherkin? Really, just the biggest thing is don't trust the media. The media isn't interested in, or most 99.9% of media that's out there, they're interested in entertainment. They're not interested in education. So it's fine for Otherkin to make our own content, but when it comes to outside media, they are interested in making entertainment. They're not interested in being true. So that avoid the media as much as possible. There are so very few TV stations where, not TV stations, but companies that have more integrity. What do you think are what is the most respectful interview? Honestly, a lot of the radio interviews, the Coast to Coast AM interviews with Jason the Horse are amazing in that extent of how respectful Ian and some of the guests that called in to ask Jason questions are very interesting. In fact, in Ian's farewell podcast, Jason was brought back, and Ian was just said very praising words to Jason about how many people over the years have kept on requesting Jason the Horse to come back for further interviews because the guests were so interested in him talking about his experiences. And Ian himself said during that radio cast of how much Jason's rapport has convinced so many people that he legitimately is a horse in human form. So it's those radio casts are very rare in how respectful and how well received a therian is on camera. Or not on camera, but among a non-kin. Have there been any non-fiction mention in media? Outside of A Field Guide to Otherkin, we don't... we've heard a few mentions of, like, especially recently when Tumblr became kind of the easiest punching bag. We recall Fictionkin being mentioned within those articles. One of them is probably in our list, but we didn't get to them because I kept rambling too much on the older stuff. But it has been mentioned, but Otherkin have not been talked very highly in the recent years, and Fictionkin seem to be their easiest punching bag of the lot, unfortunately. Completely random question, sorry. Did I miss? Is there any more questions? Sorry, chat. I started reading chat and it didn't keep going down. The famous CSI episode. I always feel so bad that towards the end, this is the second time that we've had a panel and we just kept on rambling about ourselves and then we're terrible at answering questions. Yeah, CSI, the episode was about the furry fandom, not Otherkin. Though, there was an CSI episode where they did mention therianthropy. Back when the Teen Wolf phase happened, there was a whole episode that was dedicated to lichens against werewolves. And while therianthropy was not mentioned, as someone that watched the thing, it was so painfully based on therian / teen wolves with adults instead of teenagers. It was just... I think it was called Lichens versus Vampires. I forget the name of the title, but I have a sneaky suspicion someone will quickly be able to find it if you just Google CSI episode Lichens Werewolves. It wasn't a good episode. As a CSI fan, it was a good episode. It was not a good episode. There was also a CSI episode at one point that role-playing as people that role-play as animals. One of the people did reference therianthropy, but they meant it in the anthropological sense of the word and not our use of the word therianthropy. But it still was kind of jarring to have that heard while watching a CSI episode. Question, how did you guys make such a... This is not a good panel. This is us terribly rambling about various media stuff that we have an obsession with. And thank y'all so much for everyone that has been just tossing links in chat for the last almost hour. We're going to be so going through this entire chat looking at everything that people have linked, because there are things that are in this chat now that will definitely be added to our collection. So thank you. Yeah, sorry so much for we're really running on time. So thank y'all so much for your patience with us. I hope everyone liked this panel or got some entertainment out of us rambling about this. So thank y'all so much.